The fluorescent lights of the Denver Martial Arts gym buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the worn tatami mats. Derek Mitchell, a black belt instructor with a penchant for theatrics, stood at the center of the mat, his belt gleaming like a badge of unquestionable authority. His voice boomed through the gym, slicing through the rhythmic thuds of punches and the soft shuffle of feet. "Hey, you there cleaning? How about a quick demonstration?" The words were laced with mockery, each syllable dripping with the arrogance of a man who thrived on being the center of attention. The 8 students scattered across the mat froze, their nervous glances darting between their instructor and the lone figure mopping the floor in the corner. The air grew heavy with anticipation, tinged with discomfort. James Washington, 42, paused mid-swipe, the mop handle cool against his calloused palms. For 3 weeks, he'd worked as the gym's janitor, slipping in after hours to scrub sweat and dreams from the floor while the students were long gone. Tonight, though, the advanced class had lingered past its usual time, and James found himself under the harsh glare of the gym's lights and Derek's scrutiny. "I don't want to bother you, Sensei," James said, his voice low and steady, like the hum of a distant storm. He returned to scrubbing a stubborn stain, his movements deliberate, almost meditative. But beneath the calm exterior, a flicker of something stirred in his chest. A ghost of a feeling he'd buried for 2 decades. Derek's laugh echoed, sharp and theatrical, designed to command the room. "Everyone, look at this." The guy's afraid to even step on the mat. The students' nervous chuckles followed, some forced, others tinged with unease. A young woman with her hair tied back in a tight bun, Sarah Chun, shifted uncomfortably, her brow furrowing as she exchanged a glance with the student beside her. What Derek didn't know, what no one in that gym could have known, was that James Washington wasn't just a janitor. For 20 years, he'd been running from the man he used to be, James Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. At the peak of his career, an accident had shattered his world, claiming the life of his best friend and training partner, Tony Hammer Rodriguez. The guilt had been a lead weight in his chest ever since, chaining him to a vow of silence and obscurity. He'd sworn never to fight again, to leave the ring and its ghost behind. Even his teenage daughter, Maya, knew nothing of the champion her father had been. "Come on, man," Derek pressed, striding closer with a grin that oozed condescension. "Just a little demonstration. I bet you don't even know how to do a basic guard. Let's show my students the difference between someone who trains and someone who just cleans." The word "cleans" landed like a slap, and James felt it, a spark of heat in his chest, the same fire that used to ignite him in the ring. It wasn't anger, not yet, but the awakening of something long dormant, like a muscle flexing after years of disuse. He met Derek's gaze for a fleeting moment, and something in his eyes, steady, unyielding, made the instructor take an instinctive step back. "Just an educational demonstration," Derek said, his voice faltering slightly, betraying a crack in his bravado. "Nothing serious. Just to show the beginners why it's important to respect the martial art." James set the mop bucket down with a soft clink, the sound slicing through the gym's tension. He stood slowly, his movements fluid, almost graceful, in a way that fell out of place for a man who supposedly spent his days pushing a mop. The students stopped their drills, drawn to the unfolding scene like moths to a flame. "All right," James said at last, his voice calm but resonant, like the first rumble of thunder. "But when we're done, you're going to apologize to every single person here for turning this mat into a circus." Derek's laugh was forced now, a brittle sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Apologize? Man, you'll be the one apologizing to the floor when you meet it." What Derek couldn't see, what no one could see, was the storm brewing beneath James's calm exterior. For 20 years, he'd carried the weight of Tony's death, the memory of that fateful sparring session in Las Vegas. The crowd's taunts had been relentless that night, their racist jeers cutting deeper than any punch. "Go back to the streets, champ," they'd shouted. James had let the anger consume him, throwing punches with a ferocity that wasn't his own. Tony had fallen, his head striking the mat at an unnatural angle, and he never got up. The investigation called it an accident, but James knew the truth. He'd lost control, and it had cost him everything. Now, standing on this mat, the echoes of those taunts mingled with Derek's sneers, stirring something deep within him. Not rage, but a quiet, resolute strength. A reminder of who he'd been before guilt had driven him into the shadows. Derek adjusted his black belt with a flourish, savoring the student's attention. Everyone, gather around. You're about to see a practical lesson in why there's a hierarchy in martial arts. The students formed a semicircle, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Sarah Chun, her arms crossed tightly, muttered to her classmate, "This is wrong." Her friend shook his head, his jaw clenched in disapproval. "Look, everyone," Derek continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "Here we have a perfect example of someone who never understood there are places for certain types of people. Elite gyms aren't for, well, you know." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. James's chest tightened, not with anger, but with the weight of memory. He'd heard those words before, in different gyms, different rings, different cities. They were the same words that had followed him through his career, whispered in locker rooms and shouted from the stands. They were the words that had pushed him to the edge that night in Las Vegas, when Tony paid the price for James's loss of control. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Sensei Derek, maybe we should just continue our normal training. It's getting late." Derek's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "Sarah Chun, are you questioning my teaching methodology? Sit down and watch. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than in a month of regular training." James saw the fear flicker in Sarah's eyes, the same fear he'd seen in his own reflection after Tony's death. It was the fear of standing up to power and facing the consequences. But there was something else in her gaze, defiance, a spark of courage that reminded him of his sister, Kesha. She'd been just 17 when a stray bullet stole her life during a police raid in their neighborhood. James had been halfway across the world, fighting for a title in Tokyo when he got the call. Another loss, another wound, another reason to bury Silent Storm and become just James. That Derek's voice cut through the silence. "So, Janitor, how about showing my students how to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" The laughter that followed was a dagger to James's heart. Not because it hurt him, but because it reminded him of the crowds in Las Vegas, the ones who'd laughed at his pain, his struggle, his existence. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he was back in that ring, the lights blinding, the crowd roaring, Tony's laughter echoing in his ears before everything went wrong. Derek made his first mistake then, stepping forward to shove James's shoulder, a light push meant to provoke, to assert dominance. But James didn't budge. His feet were rooted to the ground, his body absorbing the force like a mountain weathering a gust of wind. Derek's smirk faltered, his hand lingering in the air as if he'd pushed against a wall. "Interesting," James murmured, more to himself than to Derek. "It's been a while since someone tried to provoke me like that." The words were soft, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. Sarah, watching from the sidelines, felt her heart race. There was something about James's presence now, a shift so subtle, yet so profound that it sent a shiver down her spine. As a sports psychology student, she'd spent years analyzing fighters, studying their movements, their minds. What she saw in James wasn't just a janitor standing his ground. It was the awakening of a predator who'd chosen to sleep for 20 years. "Last chance, buddy," Derek said, his voice tight with irritation. "Either you accept the demonstration like a man, or I call security to escort you out. And guess what? You lose your job, too." James opened his eyes, and the room seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. Derek froze, a primal instinct screaming at him to retreat, though his pride refused to listen. "All right," James said, his voice steady but laced with an authority that made every student lean forward. "But when we're done, I want you to explain to your students why you turn a place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Derek's laugh was nervous now, a hollow sound that betrayed his growing unease. "Explain? Man, you'll be the one explaining when you're flat on your back." What Derek didn't know was that James had spent 20 years honing something far more dangerous than physical technique: emotional control. Every taunt, every sneer, every push only fueled a quiet strength within him, a clarity that had once made him untouchable in the ring. The students tightened their semicircle around the mat, their breath shallow, their eyes wide. Sarah clutched her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed a quick search: James Washington Martial Arts. The results flooded her screen, and her heart stopped. Articles, photos, grainy videos of a younger James, Silent Storm, dominating opponents with a grace and precision that seemed almost otherworldly. Retired after a tragic accident, Derek assumed his fighting stance, fists raised, weight forward, a textbook pose that had intimidated countless beginners. "Everyone, you're about to witness a lesson worth 6 months of training," he declared, his voice straining to reclaim authority. The difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who clean the floor. James stood still, his breathing slow and even, his eyes scanning Derek with the precision of a surgeon. He saw everything. The high guard that left Derek's ribs exposed, the slight lean that compromised his balance, the micro twitches in his shoulders that telegraphed every move. For 22 years, James had fought in the world's most brutal rings, facing opponents who trained to kill. Derek, with his polished gym techniques, was a child playing at war. Sarah spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Sensei Derek, why do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who's just doing their job?" The gym fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Derek's face flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment. "This has nothing to do with race," he snapped, though no one had mentioned race until he did. "It's about respect for the martial art and knowing your place." The phrase "knowing your place" hit James like a punch to the gut. It was the same phrase he'd heard in his youth, in gyms where he'd been the only black fighter, in rings where promoters told him he'd never be a star. It was the phrase that had fueled his rage the night Tony died. But now, at 42, James didn't feel rage. He felt clarity, a cold, unshakable resolve to show Derek what respect truly meant. "Sarah's right," James said, his voice carrying a quiet power that made everyone turn to him. "This isn't about martial arts. It's about you trying to feel big by making others feel small." Derek's face twisted with indignation. "How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is." James took a step forward, and the air in the room shifted. His shoulders straightened, his stance widened imperceptibly, his body settling into a balance so perfect it seemed effortless. "Actually," he said, "I know exactly what a dojo is. And I know this place stopped being one a long time ago." Derek's instinct screamed at him to stop, but his pride pushed him forward. He launched his first punch, a sharp, textbook jab aimed at James's face. It was the kind of punch that had ended countless sparring matches in his favor. But James wasn't there. His body flowed to the side, a movement so fluid it seemed almost lazy, yet impossibly precise. Derek's fist cut through empty air, and he stumbled, off balance. "Nice try," James said, his voice calm, almost kind. "Clean technique, good speed. But you telegraphed it with your shoulder." Derek's face burned with humiliation. He attacked again, a flurry of punches, jab, straight, hook, executed with the precision of years of practice. But James moved like water, slipping under the jab, leaning back from the straight, stepping just out of reach of the hook. Each miss left Derek more exposed, more desperate. "Interesting combination," James noted, his breathing still even. "Works well against someone who stands still. But you're leaving your left side wide open." Derek's chest heaved, sweat beading on his forehead. This wasn't possible. He'd landed thousands of punches in his career, and now he couldn't touch a man who'd supposedly never fought. "Stop dancing and fight," he shouted, launching a frantic combination of punches and kicks. James decided the lesson had gone on long enough. As Derek's final kick sailed past, James closed the distance in a single, effortless step. Before Derek could react, James touched his chest with the palm of his hand, a gentle, almost casual gesture. The impact was like a thunderclap. Derek flew backward, his feet leaving the ground, his body arcing through the air before crashing onto the mat with a thud that echoed through the gym. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Derek's ragged gasps as he stared at the ceiling, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched her phone, her research forgotten. She'd seen power before, but this was something else. Control so absolute it was almost serene. "Actually," James said, extending a hand to help Derek up, "it's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I learned over a 22-year career." Derek ignored the hand, scrambling to his feet, his legs unsteady. 22 years in what? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of revelation. You don't know who he is, do you? She held up her phone, the screen glowing with articles and videos. James Washington, also known as Silent Storm, five-time world mixed martial arts champion, undefeated, retired after a tragic accident. The words hit the room like a shockwave. Derek's face drained of color, his bravado crumbling as the truth sank in. He'd challenged a legend, humiliated a man whose skill dwarfed his own in ways he couldn't comprehend. I didn't know, Derek stammered, his voice small. If you had known, would you have treated me with respect? James asked, his tone gentle but piercing. Or would you have humiliated someone else, someone without a title to defend themselves? The question hung in the air, exposing the rot at the core of Derek's behavior. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady now. Sensei Derek, I've trained here for 2 years out of respect for your experience. But what I saw today wasn't teaching. It was cruelty disguised as instruction. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the students, their eyes shifting from Derek to James. The man they dismissed as a janitor had become the embodiment of everything martial arts was supposed to teach: discipline, humility, and strength rooted in character. I'm sorry, Derek said, his voice breaking. To you, James. To Sarah. To all of you. I have no excuse. James nodded, his expression softening. Apologies are a start, Derek. But the real question is, what will you do differently now? Sarah's voice broke the silence that followed. Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? Not just techniques, but what you've shown us tonight. That true strength comes with responsibility. James's smile was warm, tinged with the weight of his past. Maybe, not to teach fighting, but to teach what matters more. That respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with how you treat others. 3 months later, the gym was unrecognizable. James had been hired as an instructor, not just for his technical mastery, but for the philosophy he brought, a belief that martial arts was about building character, not egos. Sarah's discreet video of the incident had gone viral, exposing Derek's arrogance to the world. He lost half his students in a week, his reputation in tatters. Derek still taught, but in a smaller gym, his lessons now tinged with a humility born of public shame. James, meanwhile, found peace in teaching again, not to relive his past, but to honor it. Tony, Kesha, and the man he'd been before guilt had silenced him. As Sarah watched James lead a class on respect, she smiled. Thank you, Sensei James, she said after class, helping him stack mats, for showing us that true strength doesn't need to shout to be heard. James chuckled, the sound light but grounded. The best lesson is simple. Sarah, never judge someone by their job or their past. Everyone carries a story that can change everything. In the quiet of the gym, as the lights dimmed and the mats grew still, James felt the weight of 20 years lift just a little. Justice wasn't about destroying Derek. It was about showing that greatness lies not in titles, but in the courage to rise above pain and choose dignity over revenge.